Slide 1. Whether it's the relationships we choose, the emotions we feel, or the topics presented by the movies and media we consume, parenting, intelligence, sexuality, mental disorders, psychotherapy, we're swimming in a sea of psychological phenomena. These phenomena require an army of armchair psychologists to break down why he did that, or why she stayed with them after it was obvious to everyone what they were up to. Whether we like to admit it or not, we are those armchair psychologists because anytime we attempt to figure out what makes others tick, whether they be friends, family, lover, or stranger, we're engaging in psychology. We are surrounded by psychology. Slide 2. The question is, do you want to maintain your mere status as an armchair psychologist, or have the superpower skill set that lets you distinguish ideas that stop at the level of intuition from the ones that rise to the level of cognition? As my Italian mother would say, it's up to you, but I'm sure you make the right choice. No pressure. Slide 3. Kidding aside, here's the problem. Our intuitive, naive psychology about what makes people tick is good for generating ideas and hypotheses, but is tragically flawed at determining whether these ideas are correct, true, or supported by anything other than our flawed perceptions. Further, I'd say, as bad as we are at determining the validity of our intuitive understanding of others, we're even worse when it comes to understanding ourselves. Our brain evolved to understand the environment, not ourselves. Slide 4. And welcome to Psych 101, Introduction to Psychology. This lecture covers Chapter 1 in your textbook and then some. Slide 5. Throughout this lecture and the rest of the semester, I will also be relying heavily on 3 other sources. First, The Story of Psychology by Morton Hunt, and then 2 courses from the Great Courses series. I get these on Audible, but I'm sure you can get them pretty much anywhere else. I know that libraries have these. One is The Great Ideas of Psychology with Professor Daniel N. Robinson. That one's particularly fun because Professor Robinson speaks with weird flair. Old school. It's great. And Psychology of Human Behavior with Professor David W. Martin. This one's also very good. Of course, why would I use it if it wasn't very good? Slide 6. Here's the plan. Through the semester, I'm hoping to walk you through the topics that best explain what psychology is, what psychologists do, what is currently known about human psychology, how we've come to that understanding, and finally, what the future holds for psychology and psychologists. Slide 7. My goal here is to refine your understanding of psychology to the point where you will not be easily fooled by or fall for psychological myths or the kind of erroneous understandings that are handed down in folk psychology, because maybe stress doesn't cause ulcers, or maybe we use more than 10% of our brain, or maybe, just maybe, we don't see by shooting sight rays from our eyes. Towards this end, I will also be using one other source, 50 Great Myths of Popular Psychology by Scott Lilienfeld and colleagues. They point out that many of these psychological myths are based on common sense conclusions that, unfortunately, may not be very common at all, may support after-the-fact reasoning, and may provide contradictory information. Allow me to explain. Scientific explanations, like those from psychology, are often uncommon and counterintuitive, rendering the tools of intuition and common sense useless, even worse than bringing a knife to a gunfight, more like bringing a football bat to a chili eating contest. Further, what is common to you may not be common to others. In the words of Voltaire, common sense is very rare. Loosely translated, common sense isn't so common. A particular problem with common sense explanations is hindsight bias, or the I knew it all along phenomenon. This is when, after an event, People believe they knew the outcome of the event before it actually happened. Of course we knew that sports ball team was going to lose. We knew it before the game even started. We just didn't communicate that in any way, shape, or form until after they lost. After-the-fact explanations are seductive because they make sense and seem accurate. Fortunately, psychological research has many firewalls to protect the scientific process from the traps of common sense thinking. For instance, researchers must say explicitly and in advance what they expect to find as a result of their research. That is, one seeks to eventually predict future events instead of merely attempt to understand what has already happened. Another problem with common sense explanations is that multiple explanations may exist and can often be contradictory. Consider the following. Birds of a feather flock together, yet opposites attract. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, but out of sight, out of mind? Can't judge a book by its cover, yet the clothes make the man, and first impressions are lasting. Nonetheless, beauty's only skin deep. Being aware of the pitfalls of the common sense mindset will hopefully help avoid black and white, either or thinking about psychology. Slide 8. A general truth about psychology is that, to some degree, what seem incompatible theories about a psychological phenomenon can both be shown to be correct with the light of accumulating scientific knowledge. Instead of either or, maybe it's both and. So let's start with the basic introduction to psychology. Slide 9. This lecture will be broken down into two parts. First, we'll go over what psychology is and what psychologists do. Then, I'll break down the history of psychology. I'll make this last part as concise as possible without getting too far into the weeds, but there is a lot of information about the history of psychology, and to nerds like me, it's all super interesting, but I will save you from hearing about all the details. Just some of them, the good ones. Slide 10. The term psychology derives from the Greek roots psyche, meaning soul or mind, and logos, meaning word. This makes psychology the study of the mind or soul, a definition used until the early 1900s, when psychologists switched their focus and began defining their field as the study of behavior. These behaviorists wanted nothing to do with that mysterious black box of the mind filled with the things they couldn't observe, like thoughts or emotions or motivations. Rather, they rallied around a research agenda with the goal of using observed behaviors to make psychology a true empirical science. Towards the middle of the 20th century and onward, psychologists became interested in the mind again, but not so much the soul. Currently, and for the purposes of this class, we define psychology as the study of behavior and experience. The word experience lets us discuss your perceptions about events without implying that a mind or soul exists independently of your body. That is, psychological research is done under the assumption that the mind is the result of the brain. They are one. This may seem contrary to someone's general worldview or specific religious belief, which may hold that there is a mind or soul separate from our physical body. We've stumbled onto the mind-body problem, a concept which is among three major philosophical questions related to psychology, along with free will and nature versus nurture. The mind-body problem. To reiterate the above points with a twist, instead of thinking like dualists who feel there is a duality between mind and brain, or that the mind is separate from the brain, psychologists do research as monists who feel the mind and brain are one thing, hence the mono prefix, that the mind is consequent of brain material. Another way to think of this is that dualists think the mind can exist without a brain because they are two different things. Monists think the mind and brain are the same thing, so there is no mind without a brain. Is this philosophically correct? Has psychology solved the mind-body problem? Not likely. But we have sufficient evidence that damage to or removal of certain parts of the brain alter aspects of what we consider mind, which means these brain parts are important for the cause of these mental events. While this is a fruitful line of research, it may not address all the philosophical sophistication deserving of the mind-body problem. Free will? Another philosophical question we'll bump up against has to do with how free we are to make our choices that affect our behaviors on the world. Are our thoughts and behaviors determined by our biology or the way we're raised? Could we have chosen differently? That is, do we have free will? Free will is the idea that our behaviors are caused by our own independent decisions. The countering view to free will is called determinism, which is the belief that everything that happens has a cause or a determinant that someone else can observe and measure. If you think it's a little bit of both, there's a category for you too. In philosophy, this middle ground is called compatibilism. Thinking about how free we are to make choices in our world will come up when we look at psychological topics like personality or intelligence, learning, abnormal psychology, and even psychotherapy. In fact, it is woven into any topics that address questions raised by the third and final philosophical question related to psychology: nature or nurture? How do we disentangle how much of any psychological phenomenon can be accounted for by what we're born with biologically or genetically, and how much can be accounted for by the environment and culture in which we're raised? How much is nature and how much is nurture? If we find out that a character trait is strongly genetic, how determined are we to exhibit that trait? What if it's a bad trait like hostility? Can someone just point to it as the reason why they're being an asshole and not be held accountable because it's just in their nature? What if it's a good trait like success? Could someone with this genetic predisposition for success blame their environment if they don't reach their goals of success? Since it's unethical to mix and match human genes and environments, we will see that research on twins, adopted children, and adopted twin children helps inform psychological research trying to disentangle nature from nurture. Keep these philosophical questions in mind as we continue to explore the study of behavior and experience by looking at what psychologists do. Slide 11. When most people think of what a psychologist looks like and what a psychologist does, they usually conjure up an image of an old man with thick glasses and a cigar taking notes while listening to someone who is on a couch talking about their mother, the prototypical Freudian therapist. If I press a little, I'll sometimes get images of somebody in a white lab coat taking notes while watching rats in a maze. Both of these stereotypes are legitimate, and each represent a different version of what psychologists do. I like to think about psychology as an umbrella term under which there exist two different branches of psychology. There's the clinical branch and the experimental branch. Slide 12. Clinical psychologists provide therapy and counseling and are represented by the first stereotype, the therapist, because they provide counseling. While counseling is usually envisioned as a one-to-one or small group interaction done by mental health professionals, not all fields of clinical psychology are services provided to an individual. Some fields of psychology also provide services to organizations to help them run better as a whole. These psychologists could provide services at schools to better facilitate the education of children based on psychological understandings of how children learn, or in the military or any other organization where an understanding of group psychology could be of use. Whether providing services to individuals or organizations, clinical psychologists make up about 2/3 of employed psychologists. The remaining third of psychologists teach and do research. Yay! We love this third of psychologists. This is the best third of psychologists. Nothing against those other 2/3 of psychologists, but this third of psychologist, kinda awesome. Anyway, these are the experimental psychologists who study specific aspects of human behavior and experience. For instance, developmental psychologists are focused on the development of humans from before birth through old age and to death. Sensory psychologists, such as myself, we study the psychology of senses. I happen to study the psychology of the sense of smell. Psychologists in this category are frequently both teaching as professors and doing research at universities like this one, right now. Research that you will be participating in, so that you don't have to write a paper, so that I don't have to read a paper. That is, psychologists are balancing the teaching of courses with a research program that they're conducting at the university for the purpose of publishing in peer-reviewed journals and adding to the intellectual commons. A lot of psychological research happens at universities just like this one. Slide 13. Let us now endeavor on the origin story of psychology. The beginning of this lecture was like the cold open, where we just assumed there is this field called psychology with a definition and connections to philosophy and people psychologizing in varied ways. Now it's time to explore how psychology came barreling to Earth in a spaceship from its mother planet to eventually fight for level-headed understandings of human behavior and experience. I'm going to leave that laugh take in. All right, slide 14. Questions that touch on psychology have been asked since the beginning of written history. What better place to start exploring these questions than ancient Greece, where powerhouse thinkers were pondering, among other things, the ins and outs of knowledge. What is knowledge? How do we know what we think we know? I apologize in advance for how brief a treatment these philosophers will get. Let's start with Socrates and Plato. So Plato is fun because it is through his writings that we learn about the ideas of Socrates, who himself didn't have any writings of his own. Because of this, there is a blurring of which ideas we should attribute to which philosophers. Nonetheless, an idea attributed to both Plato and Socrates is the notion that we are born with all the knowledge we need, and all that we would need to do to discover it is self-reflect. Neither Socrates nor Plato trusted the senses because of their unreliability to reflect reality. They're too easily fooled and manipulated. Knowledge could, therefore, never come through sense impressions. Rather, it is through self-reflection and reason that one discovers true knowledge. It is the knowledge we are born with and that exists in our eternal mind or soul. Once we have access to these universal laws through reflection, Plato suggests we can then use deductive reasoning to apply these general rules to specific events, behaviors, or experiences. Deductive reasoning is the kind we use in formal logic or maths, where we memorize rules and laws, then practice employing these general rules on particular examples. Moving on to Aristotle. Aristotle, one of Plato's best students, was also interested in deductive reasoning, but repeatedly stressed the importance of its opposite, inductive reasoning as well. Induction begins with the observations of specific instances and derives a general principle or rule from those observations. With this emphasis on induction, Aristotle betrays an opposition to his teachers by considering sense perceptions thought to be illusory and untrustworthy as actually the essential raw materials for knowledge. This raw material gets processed by the thinking mind, or psyche, using the sense perceptions and remembered perceptions to arrive at general truths. Once these general truths are established, then deduction can be used to predict future behavior. The soul is, therefore, not born with knowledge according to Aristotle, but acquires it through experience. Further, Aristotle rejected the soul, mind, or psyche as an entity that exists outside the body, giving a final thumb in the eye of his former school of thought. This basic review of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle is meant to point out that there have been theories about the natural state of the mind since the beginning of recorded history, and the questions raised then are remarkably similar to the ones we're still grappling with today. What traits are we born with? Which do we acquire from the environment? Can sensory information be trusted? Why do the new Star Wars movies suck? With these questions and more, we move on to the 1600s. Slide 15. Rene Descartes laid the foundation for a surge in philosophical thinking that was very scientific, rational, and skeptical of the knowledge acquired and handed down over the first millennium and a half. This was the beginning of the Enlightenment period in Europe. Slide 16. Rene Descartes' goal was to reject all opinions he could doubt in the pursuit of his very existence. Senses, reasoning, and thoughts are out of the question because, respectively, senses can deceive, reasoning can fail, and thoughts can be illusions. Descartes comes to the conclusion that his very existence is his thinking self. Quote, "It is absolutely necessary that I, who thought this, was something. I observed that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so certain and so evident that no ground of doubt could shake it." End quote. Here's another awesome quote. This time I'm going to do it in my old-timey voice. "I concluded that I was a thing or substance whose whole essence or nature was only to think, and which, to exist, has no need for space or of any material thing or body. This it follows from this ego, this mind, this soul by which I am what I am, is entirely distinct from the body. Even if the body does not exist, the soul would not cease to be all that is now." I love doing my old-timey voice, even though Descartes was French. You can just pretend that that is my French accent. Descartes' views seem like a recapitulation of Platonic thinking in the sense that self-reflection led Descartes to a universal truth about existence, which is that we are a mind or soul, an essence we are born with that has innate knowledge of God. This mind or soul is independent of the body that houses it during a human lifetime. Slide 17. What Descartes was for the resurgence of Platonic thinking amongst Enlightenment thinkers, John Locke was Aristotelian. I hope I'm saying that word right. John Locke was Aristotelian ? Thinking. In addressing whether or not we have innate ideas, Locke addressed Descartes' claims that we must have an innate idea of God since we do not experience him directly by refuting it, since people have been found that have no such idea that a God exists. Rather, we derive our idea of God from visible marks of extraordinary wisdom and power in all the works of creation, according to Locke. The phrase tabula rasa, which roughly translates to blank slate, is often used in reference to John Locke, but as far as I understand, he never actually used that term. What he did say is, quote, "Let us then suppose the mind at birth to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? I answer in one word, from experience. In that, all our knowledge is founded, and from that it ultimately derives itself. So, white paper, blank slate, tabula rasa, I think we get the idea. We are born blank, and our knowledge is written on us through experience with the environment. All knowledge is founded in experience." Slide 18. In the 1700s, David Hume posited that the mind is made up entirely of perceptions or impressions that come from objects in the outside world or stimuli from inside world like memories, reflections, or dreams. Quote, "When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I may venture to affirm the same of the rest of mankind, that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions." End quote. For Hume, these simple impressions are the components from which more complex and abstract ideas are built, and the thing that unites these simple elements are their principal associations. That is, perceptions and impressions are connected because they somewhat resemble each other, they happen to occur around the same time or around the same place, or one occurs right before the other such that we perceive a cause-effect relationship. An inference of the theories of Locke and Hume is that our perceptions and senses are the building blocks of the mind, and this philosophical focus on perceptions and senses is the perfect segue into the first psychological studies. What better subject matter of study than the very raw materials of abstract thought, sensations, and perceptions? Slide 19. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, many researchers followed this very line of thought and concentrated on the studies of the senses. Another appeal of sensory research is it allows you to start with relatively easy answerable questions. Reaction time, visual acuity, and perception of tactile stimuli were certainly easier to study and measure than something messy like, say, personality. Early psychologists discovered major differences between the concentration of physical stimuli and the corresponding intensity of psychological perceptions. The mathematical description of the relationship between a physical stimulus and its perceived properties is called a psychophysical function because it relates the perception of psychology to physics of external stimuli. Such research demonstrated the feasibility of scientific research on psychological questions. Dun dun dun. Slide 20. Here is a day in the life of Ernst Weber. Take a draftsman compass and touch the two ends on a blindfolded participant. Noticing that the farther apart the points, the easier it is to perceive two separate points. But as the 2 points get closer, there comes a critical distance where they are perceived as 1 point. That critical distance is known as the just noticeable difference, or the JND, because it is the point at which you can reliably detect the distance of 2 points on your skin as 2 separate sensations. In teasing out the JND of tactile or touch stimuli, Ernst Weber was performing psychology's first true experiments by altering one variable at a time to observe how it affects a second variable. His hypothesis is, the smallest difference we can perceive between two stimuli is not objective, but rather subjective, and it varies with the intensity of the stimulus. This hypothesis has been tested and supported enough to be considered a psychophysical law, Weber's law. For each sensory modality, the ratio between the perceived just noticeable difference and the objective magnitude of the standard stimulus is a constant. For example, regardless of the starting magnitude for how intense light is, it requires an increase or decrease of 1/60th of the starting magnitude for us to notice a difference. Slide 21. In 1879, Wilhelm Wundt established the first laboratory devoted to psychological research in Leipzig, Germany. One of Wundt's goals was to find the elements of experience, comparable to those of chemistry. Psychology's elements were, he maintained, sensations and feelings. At any moment, you might experience the taste of a fine meal, the sound of good music, and a certain degree of pleasure. These elements would merge into a compound that was your experience. Furthermore, Wundt maintained your experience is partly under your voluntary control. You can shift your attention from one element to another and get a different experience. To test his idea about the components of experience, Wundt, like Weber, presented various kinds of lights, textures, and sounds, and he asked participants to report the intensity and quality of their sensations. That is, he asked them to introspect, to look within themselves, and focus their attention on an element of experience. He recorded the changes in people's reports as he changed the stimuli. Wundt's methods and research program became known as the New Psychology at its time and carried its ideas through Europe and America through its many students. Slide 22. But it took an American, of course, to be both a student and a critic of Wundt's New Psychology. William James was too impatient to wait for each tiny grain of experience to be analyzed and assembled into a larger experience. Instead of this structuralist approach of the New Psychology, James preferred a functional approach that maintained the use of introspection but focused it on the everyday experiences as we experience them. That is, without focusing on all the tiny components that make up its structure. Putting it bluntly, he thought any effort to seize and isolate individual elements of a thought process by means of Wundtian introspection would be doomed to failure. This is because consciousness and experience function as a process, not as a thing. For James, when we introspect, we are being exposed to the process of thoughts generated and flowing like a complex stream of ideas. This approach doesn't dovetail with structuralist attempts to break down a static object, like the New Psychology attempted. There are no static objects of the mind, according to William James, just a stream of consciousness. Slide 23. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection influenced psychology in many ways. In addition to bruising the human ego by considering us just another animal, it opened our eyes to the power of invisible forces on our perceptions. Darwin argued that humans and other species share a remote common ancestor, placing humans in the category of all other living organisms. If this is the case, then other animals should share features in common with humans, including some degree of intelligence. So why not test other animals to find out more about humans? Early comparative psychologists set out to measure animal intelligence and decided that the relative intelligence of non-human animals was a pointless endeavor because different species excel in different ways, and it doesn't make sense to rank order them. Another more subtle influence that Darwin's theory of evolution has had on the way people thought in general, and psychologists specifically, is the idea that there are greater unseen forces that shape what we currently see. If we can view the current population of species as a result of millions of years of natural selection, what else can we currently see that is the result of years of unseen dynamic forces? Slide 24. In the 1900s, Dr. Sigmund Freud developed a theory that was simultaneously the first attempt at a developmental theory of humans, a personality theory, a way to discover and diagnose mental disorders, and a method for treating these disorders. It also removes gum from the bottom of your shoe. It also serves to spackle your walls and wax your floor. It revolved around the inner workings of the unconscious mind, an invisible part of consciousness where the interaction of other invisible dynamic forces determine what you think, what you feel, and how you behave. Freud saw himself as the Darwin of psychology with his discovery of the unconscious mind's inner workings through guided introspection, and laid the groundwork with his psychiatric practice of psychoanalysis for clinical psychology. The popularity of Freud's theory, with its use of introspection as a therapeutic technique to reveal the human mind at the unconscious level, combined with the introspective approach used in experimental research by Wundt's New Psychology and James's functional psychology programs, this left some experimental psychologists thirsting for a more observable and scientific way of studying human behavior, Everybody's using introspection, and introspection is very difficult to quantify. This was the beginning of behaviorism. Slide 25. As I said, introspection isn't reliable or easily measured. Behavior is. With Darwin's theory of evolution opening the door for using animal models to learn about human behavior, the backdrop was set for behaviorism. Behaviorism is a field of psychology that concentrates on observable, measurable behaviors and not on mental processes. It is essentially an approach to learning, but it doesn't matter what you're thinking, what you're feeling, or what your incentives or motivations are if I can predict your behavior by manipulating your environment. Knowing the contents of your thoughts is unnecessary. John B. Watson is frequently referred to as the founder of behaviorism, and he was quite the cheerleader for behaviorism in the early 1900s, selling books, writing articles, giving advice for child rearing. Because of Watson's popularization of behaviorism, many psychologists optimistically expected to discover simple, stimulus-response laws of behavior. Slide 26. The post-World War II era of behaviorism produced one of the last popularizers and luminaries of the movement, B.F. Skinner, who inadvertently signaled the beginning of the end of behaviorism in his 1957 attempt to explain language acquisition. Further, as research progressed along the behaviorist agenda, psychologists found that the behavior of a rat in a maze was way more complicated than they had expected. While psychologists continue to study animal learning, the goals and methods have changed. Slide 27. The Second World War and the U.S. involvement in it occurred at a time in psychological history when behaviorism was dominating experimental psychology and Freudian psychoanalysis was dominating psychiatry. When soldiers began returning home from the war en masse in the late 1940s with symptoms of shell shock, or what is now termed post-traumatic stress disorder, there was a need for therapists to treat our veterans. Well, psychiatry is actually a branch of medicine, and medical school training is quite arduous. Clinical psychologists did exist at the time, but they were mostly PhDs in experimental psychology who administered tests for assessments. Unlike psychologists who were medical doctors, clinical psychologists didn't treat disorders and couldn't, and still cannot, prescribe medicine. Seeing a demand for therapy services without the appropriate supply of therapists, the U.S. Veterans Administration set up doctoral-level programs for clinical psychology trained specifically in techniques of therapy. In 1950, half of those graduating with a PhD in psychology were clinical psychologists, still not able to prescribe meds, but qualified and licensed to provide therapy. In sum, the field of clinical psychology as we currently know it was born out of the need by the government to treat our veterans. Slide 28. A necessity for the warring factions of World War II was the ability to decode messages they intercepted from the enemy to help collect intelligence. Due to the increasing complexity of coding used to create the messages, more and more sophisticated ways of decoding need to be developed to keep up. Think hackers and cybersecurity, except with computing machines that took up whole rooms to do what our calculators currently do. Computing machines led, through innovation, to thinking machines that could solve logic problems, which provided a schematic layout of how a mind could possibly be constructed. There's information inputs, there's short-term memory or RAM, there's long-term memory on the hard drive, there's ways to store, retrieve, and manipulate information. Pretty good. Psychologists now had a robust as-if model they could use to ask questions about the human mind, much to the chagrin of behaviorists. A young linguist, Noam Chomsky, addressed Skinner's 1957 behavioristic attempt to explain language acquisition, mentioned above, in a review of Skinner's book. In doing so, Chomsky took Skinner and behaviorism as a whole to task as he eviscerated Skinner's foray into language and linguistics and, in doing so, exposed the limitations of behaviorism. Chomsky merely pointed to the generativity of language, that we can invent an infinite amount of sentences from a finite set of words, to dismiss behavioral reinforcement as the sole contributor to language acquisition. There must be something happening cognitively to account for this generativity. Chomsky was a voice for this growing field of cognition-oriented research and model building, inspired by the advance of computers. The cognitive revolution was in full swing. Slide 29. With the onset of the cognitive revolution, which some would say we are still in, psychologists became interested in more and more specialized topics related to the mind: memory, learning, emotion, personality, intelligence, etc., etc. And also, they were more interested in different aspects of the environment: human development, social learning, bonding, persuasion. Today, few psychologists expect a grand theory that will revolutionize our understanding in the same way that Darwin revolutionized biology, or the way that Wundt or Weber were looking for with their psychophysical functions or their structuralist new psychology. Slide 30. Most psychologists today attempt to answer more limited questions. Basic research seeks theoretical knowledge for its own sake, such as understanding the processes of learning and memory. Applied research deals with practical problems, such as how to help children with learning disabilities. The two kinds of research are mutually supportive. Understanding the basic processes helps applied researchers develop effective interventions. Those working toward practical solutions sometimes discover principles that are theoretically important. Slide 31. Today's psychologists study a wide variety of topics. Cognitive psychology has replaced behaviorist approaches to learning as the dominant field of experimental psychology. Other new approaches, such as neuroscience, evolution psychology, and health psychology, are also becoming widespread. Of particular interest is positive psychology. Slide 32. To conclude, allow me to make psychology as relatable as possible. As a student in any class, never mind in an intro to psych class, you want to know the best way to learn so you can streamline your educational process and get the best grades that you can. It just so happens that the very process of learning and all the questions that arise along the way are the topics covered in this class. You're welcome. You're going to be introduced to information, some of which you may already know or aligns with things you already understand, and some of which is new and requires some learning. In other words, you'll be balancing what is called the assimilation of familiar information and the accommodation of new information. We'll talk more about this when we discuss cognitive development in Chapter 5. For the new information, some learning through studying and memorizing will be required. Well, theories of learning will be covered in Chapter 6, while theories of memory will be covered in Chapter 7. Admittedly, even if everybody dedicated exactly the same amount of time studying and learning, some students would show more of an aptitude or intelligence for the material, while other students would be good at delaying gratification, making them very effective at studying. Both will likely get good grades, and it can be assumed that the love child of both approaches, that is, a talented student who also puts time into dedicated studying, will reign supreme. Theories of intelligence will be covered in Chapter 9, while theories of personality are in Chapter 14. Reigning supreme is not covered in this course, but I really recommend that you try it in any way possible. As the semester progresses, it's inevitable that stress will ratchet up, and with increased stress, there may be downstream consequences that'll affect your sleep or appetite, which in turn will affect your energy level, affecting your mood and how patient you are with little shit, affecting your motivation to pursue or fulfill your responsibilities, leading to feelings of being overwhelmed or shamed for not being perfect. You don't need me to tell you how a semester ramps up and how that affects your mood and motivation. You do, however, need me to tell you that this is normal, and that theories of motivation are covered in Chapter 11, theories of emotion are covered in Chapter 12, and diagnosis and treatments are covered in Chapter 15. Lastly, and to be clear, if you need to talk to somebody about your mood, thoughts, or feelings, there is no shame in that game. The university has resources available, and I have them linked in the syllabus. We're in this together. All kidding aside. Slide 34. So there you have it. We are surrounded by psychology. Even the process of studenting can be used to demonstrate it. Slide 35. And we're done with the responsibilities for the first week of the semester. All of those amazing, awesome sounding topics mentioned earlier will be covered through the semester according to the schedule presented here and in your syllabus. I'm super excited to present this information to you if it's the first time you've heard it. Actually, I'm jealous. I wish I could relive the experience of these concepts being presented for the first time. Slide 36. This lecture covered a basic introduction to what psychology is and what we do, as well as the historical milestones that have led up to what we currently understand as psychology, both clinical and experimental. I will see you for the next lecture.